Hello and welcome to another video tutorial. Today we are going to sew the Jakob jacket. You might have seen in the intro videos that this jacket is quite versatile. You have the choice of two different body lengths. You can sew it with a collar or a round neck, and then you have the choice of two different pockets, square shaped patch pockets or roundish pockets edged with bias tape. So based on the version and fabric choice, you can create very different looks from this pattern. The edges are being finished with bias tape and the jacket has a lining. If you want, you can also sew the jacket without a lining. In that case, you will have to finish all the inside seams. And there is one seam which is possibly visible from the outside, which is the collar seam here. But there is an extra chapter in this video tutorial and also in the written instructions where you can see how to sew in the collar with the seam being nicely finished. Regarding the difficulty, I would say it's not that difficult, but there are two points to consider. First is bias tape. Bias tape is not the easiest, especially if you are a beginner. It needs a lot of patience and you have to work very precise to get it done neatly, but at the end of the day it's just a matter of practice. So if you're a beginner and you have never sewn with bias tape before, I would recommend just to cut a random fabric piece and attach bias tape to it just to get the hang of it. The second point is the fabric choice. We don't have the possibility to add a lot of extra length to the lining. Usually lining jackets are longer than the outer ones to avoid the outer jacket from bulging around the lining. Like for example, this is your lining fabric and this is your outer fabric, and your outer fabric is stretching out a little bit. It would gather at the hem and it would bulge and it doesn't look that nice. For that reason, make sure to check your outer fabric and stretch it in every direction to see whether it has a bit stretch or not. If your outer fabric has stretch, pick a lining fabric that has also stretch, like a knit fabric, a lightweight cotton knit fabric. And if you pull at your outer fabric and it doesn't move at all and has no stretch, you can use a lightweight woven fabric for the lining, like a lining taffeta or a lightweight cotton woven fabric. Also, you need to consider that teddy plush fabrics, although they look very heavy, they are in most of the cases, not always, but in most of the cases, these are knitted fabrics and they are thus stretchy and they require a knit lining. To make Jakob, you will need fabric, one main fabric. Therefore, you can use coat fabrics, felted wool, quilted fabrics or teddy plush fabrics. And for the lining, you will need a lightweight fabric. As I mentioned before, it is important to check the stretch of your outer fabric and choose a lining fabric based on that. If your outer fabric is stretchy, pick a lightweight knit fabric like a cotton knit, and if your outer fabric has no stretch at all, you can use a lightweight woven, for example cotton or lining taffeta fabric for the lining. Then you will need bias tape. I prefer to work with woven cotton bias tape, but you can also use a knitted bias tape. Then you will need snap fasteners. I use those with a diameter of 12 millimeters and I attach them with my Prüm Vario pliers. They work pretty well for me. And last but not least, you will need some interfacing to reinforce the position of your snap fasteners. I use H250 here, and if you're sewing the version with the collar, you will need some lightweight interfacing to reinforce the collar as well. I would recommend H180 or H200 here. Here is an overview of all the pattern pieces that you will need. You might have to add a little pleat to your back piece from lining fabric. I will explain that in a second. And if you don't want to add any lining at all, you don't need any of the lining pieces, and in that case you will also just need one of the collar pieces. If your lining fabric is a non-elastic woven fabric, we have to add a little pleat to the center back to avoid the outer fabric from bulging around the lining fabric. place it to your fold so that the bottom edge is laying flush with your fabric fold, and then rotate your pattern piece so that it lays 2 centimeters away from the fold. Then cut it out, and last but not least, add a little marking at the position where the original pattern piece was laying. Next, transfer other markings to your fabric with tailor's chalk or a little notch, and also mark the center back with a little notch. We then need to transfer the position of the snap fasteners to all of the 4 front pieces as well. I always push pins right through the center of my markings, and then I can mark the position at the other side. I will transfer the position of the snap fasteners to the right fabric side of my front pieces, and next I will push pin through that marking so I can mark the position at the other side too, and these steps I will repeat with my lining pieces as well. And if you're sewing the jacket with a collar, then mark the position of the snap fasteners at those two. Next, the pocket position is being transferred to both front pieces from main fabric. I always cut right into the marking, right at the marking, and I will cut a bit of the corners and also right at the bottom edge. Usually it's enough to mark the position at the corners and the bottom. You don't have to trace the pocket position all the way around. And once I've cut into the marking, I will transfer the position with tailor's chalk, and after that I will remove the pattern piece and place it to the other side so I can transfer the markings to the other front piece from main fabric too. Make sure to use a pen that can be removed easily because this marking may remain visible later too. Next, I'm going to reinforce the position of the snap fasteners with interfacing. I'm using H250 here, and I've cut it to little dots with a diameter of approximately 3 centimeters. The dots are being pressed to all of the 4 front pieces to the wrong fabric side. And I always place parchment paper on my ironing board to protect it, then put the front piece and the interfacing on top, and then another layer of parchment paper on top to protect my iron, and then I just pressed the dots to all of my 4 front pieces. If you're sewing the jacket with the collar, you will have 2 collar pieces, and at one of them we are going to press little dots to the position of the snap fasteners as well, to the wrong fabric side, and the other one is being reinforced fully. I'm using a lighter interfacing here like H200 or H180, and I always cut it out roughly, then press it on, and after that I will cut it out neatly. Next, we're going to sew the pocket edged with bias tape. If you want to sew the square shaped pocket, jump into the next chapter, take your pocket and bias tape. You will find a marking at the bottom of the pocket. Start to pin your bias tape to the right fabric side of your pocket so that it's protruding the marking by 1 centimeter. Then fold it to the bias tape so that the resulting edge is flush with your marking. Then pin the bias tape up to the first corner. You will see that here comes a curve, and it's really important that at the curve you are pinning the bias tape very loosely and slightly compressed so that the curve won't bulge later. If you want, you can also clip into the bias tape and stop 2 millimeters before the first fold, but you can also just pin and sew it on and clip into the bias tape later. I think it's even a bit easier. Now only pin the bias tape up to 1 centimeter before the first corner. It's best to measure the distance 1 centimeter from the top edge and place a pin right there as a marking. Now sew on the tape with a regular straight stitch 1 centimeter away from the edge right at the first fold, back stitch at the beginning and the end, and stop 1 centimeter before the top edge. This is what it will look like now. Next, we're going to fold the bias tape outwards. So here is a 45-degree angle right at the corner. Pin it in place here. And the tape is also forming an extension to the upper edge. And then fold it over so that it's laying flush with the upper edge, and pin everything in place here. Now you can see that there is another corner. So here again, only pin up to 1 centimeter before the next corner. Now stitch with a regular straight stitch. Start right at the edge. Don't leave a gap here. Back stitch at the beginning and the end. Stitch 1 centimeter away from the edge right at the first fold, and stop 1 centimeter before the corner. This is what it will look like now, and here is another corner. So first we're going to fold the bias tape upwards so that it forms an extension to the side edge, and there is a 45-degree angle right at a corner, and then fold the bias tape down so that it's laying flush with the side edge again, and then pin everything in place. And here again is a curve, so make sure to pin very loosely and slightly compressed. And if you want, you can already clip into the tape, or you can do that later. Once you reach the starting position, the bias tape is being pinned so that it overlaps the starting point, the folded edge, by 1 centimeter. Here you can cut it to size. And now we're going to stitch the rest of the bias tape to the pocket. Here again, start right at the top edge. Stitch with a regular straight stitch 1 centimeter away from the edge right at the first fold. This is what it should look like now. The beginning and end are overlapping for a nice transition. Now we only have to wrap the bias tape around the seam allowances all the way around and pin it in place. I would recommend to pin from the outside right at the height that you will be stitching later, so you can check if you've caught the tape on the wrong fabric side. At the corners there will be some kind of diagonal seam, and on the wrong fabric side right at the corners, just fold the bias tape over each other. If you're struggling to fit the bias tape around your seam allowance, you can stretch it a little bit to fit it, and if it doesn't help, you can just cut back. the seam allowance is approximately 1 to 2 millimeters to make it easier to wrap the bias tape around it. Here you can see how the inside of the corner looks like, and I would recommend to use a lot of pins to make sure nothing shifts. This is what it will look like, and if your pocket is a little bit wavy like mine, you can just pull at the bias tape because it's stretchier than you think, and it will help to flatten the pocket. Now it's time to stitch. We're going to stitch right at the height of the pins inside the tape, approximately 1 to 2 millimeters away from the seam. I'm stitching with a regular straight stitch all the way around. At the corners, I always recommend to leave the needle in the fabric, lift your presser foot, rotate your pocket by 90 degrees and continue sewing. This way you will get nice and sharp corners. This is what it will look like. If you want, you can now press it flat and then repeat all these steps with the other pocket as well, and then take both front pieces from your main fabric and place the pockets to the right fabric side, right to the markings. Pin everything in place. I would recommend to pin with a lot of pins so nothing can shift. And once you've pinned everything in place, we're going to stitch in a U shape as my finger shows here. The upper edge will be left open. I'm stitching inside the tape 1 to 2 millimeters away from the outer edge with a regular straight stitch. If you have, you can use an upper transportation presser foot. It will make it easier so that nothing shifts, but I'm not using mine here and it works too. And once everything is stitched, you can now give it a final press. Take your pocket pieces, you will find markings at the sides. If your fabric is prone to fraying, finish the raw edges all the way around. My fabric is not fraying, that's why I am not doing it. And then fold and pin the fabric 2 centimeters to the wrong fabric side, right until the marking, namely the longer part of the side with the marking. Now we're going to stitch this little part right until the marking with a regular straight stitch and a 1.5 centimeter distance to the edge. This is what it will look like, and now we are going to pin the rest of the edges 2 centimeters to the wrong side of the fabric all the way around. Now take both front pieces from main fabric and place the pocket on the right fabric side. The piece that you just top stitched is facing towards the side and also facing upwards, and then just pin the pocket within the markings all the way around. I would recommend to use a lot of pins to make sure nothing shifts. Next we're going to stitch the pocket to the front piece as my finger shows, starting at the seam, and then I will stitch up to 2 to 3 millimeters away from the edge and then all the way around. I'm using a regular straight stitch and I'm stitching as the red line shows, with a distance of 2 to 3 millimeters from the edge. If you have, you can use an upper transportation presser foot. It will help to make sure the pocket won't shift. At every corner I would recommend to leave the needle in the fabric, lift your presser foot, rotate your fabric by 90 degrees and then continue sewing to make sure the corners get nice and sharp. And if you're using a teddy fabric like I do here, you can also sew on the pocket with a big zigzag stitch. I will show that in the next clip because that looks pretty good on teddy fabrics. As promised, this is how it works with a big zigzag stitch. I would recommend it for teddy fabrics. Set your sewing machine to a big zigzag stitch and sew so that the needle hits the pocket and the next time it hits just your front piece and then your pocket again and so on. Here you can see the difference. The lower edge is stitched on with a zigzag stitch and all the rest is sewn on with a regular straight stitch. If you cut your back lining piece with a movement pleat, we need to stitch it. Fold your back piece so that right fabric sides are facing and pin right at the marking, and then stitch a few centimeters, like 2 to 3 centimeters downwards right at the marking with a regular straight stitch. Next we're going to sew the shoulder and side seams. Therefore take your back piece and both front pieces from main fabric and place them with right fabric sides facing and then pin them together along the shoulders and also the sides. And first I will do this for my pieces from main fabric, and after that I will repeat these steps with my front pieces and back piece from lining fabric as well. This is what my main jacket and also my lining jacket now look like, and next I will stitch across the shoulders and along the sides with a regular straight stitch and a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and after that I will press the seam allowances open. And next we're going to sew in the collar. If you're sewing the jacket without it, you can dump 2 chapters into the chapter sleeves. And if you're sewing the jacket without a lining, you can jump into the next chapter where I will show you how to sew in the collar while covering the seam. First, take your collar, the one that you have fully reinforced, and your outer jacket from main fabric, and pin the collar right sides facing into the neckline. Match up the marking at the collar with your center back marking. And once you have pinned the collar into the neck, repeat these steps with your lining jacket and the other collar. If your lining has a movement pleat, you can just fold it into any direction and pin it in place, and then just pin the collar to your lining the same way as you did with your main jacket. Now it's time to stitch, and I'm stitching with a regular straight stitch and a 1 cm seam allowance. As always, make sure to go slowly, not to cause any creases, and then press the seam allowances towards the jacket. If you're sewing the jacket without a lining, I'm going to show you how to cover the seam of the collar, which is the only one that might be visible from the outside. Take some bias tape and pin it to the wrong fabric side of your collar. Once you've reached the end, you can cut it to size. Next, grab your jacket and pin the collar to the neckline of your jacket. The marking at the collar will meet the center back, and the collar is being pinned to the right fabric side of the jacket. Basically, the collar is now sandwiched between the jacket and the bias tape. Next, stitch with a 1 cm seam allowance and a regular straight stitch. Basically, you're stitching right on the first fold of your bias tape. Next, fold the seam allowance and the bias tape downwards towards the jacket, and then you can wrap the bias tape around the seam allowance and then just pin everything in place. And once you've pinned everything in place, it's time to top stitch right on the bias tape, approximately 1 to 2 millimeters away from the edge with a regular straight stitch. Now take all of your 4 sleeve pieces and fold them lengthwise, right sides facing, and pin them together along the sleeve seams. Once you have pinned the outer sleeves, make sure to check if you have a mirrored pair. Basically, if you place them mirrored, the marking should be facing upwards on both sleeve pieces, as you can see here. And then I'm going to repeat the same thing with my sleeves from lining fabric, and then it's time to stitch. I'm sewing with a 1 cm seam allowance and a regular straight stitch. Next, we're going to set in the sleeves. The jacket is with wrong fabric side facing out, while the sleeve is with right fabric side facing out. And now the sleeve and the side seam will meet, and there is a marking at the sleeve that will meet the front marking at the front armhole, and another marking at the sleeve head which will meet the shoulder seam. And then I will pin the sleeve into the armhole all the way around, and once it's done I will repeat these steps with the other sleeves, and after that with the other 2 sleeves from my lining fabric. This is what it will look like, and now it's time to stitch. We're stitching all the way around with a 1 centimeter seam allowance and a regular straight stitch. And this is how all the 4 sleeve pieces are being sewn in. I'd recommend to try on the jacket now, as the sleeve is already in its final length, and if you don't like the length of the sleeve, you still have the chance to shorten it, and therefore just cut it off at the sleeve hem by the same amount at the main and lining jacket. To sew both jackets together, turn your lining jacket wrong fabric side out, while your main jacket remains with right fabric side facing out. And now place the lining jacket inside the main jacket so that wrong fabric sides are together and you can no longer see any seam. Next, we're going to pin both jackets together at all remaining open edges. At the front, I'm pinning both layers so that they are exactly laying flush, but at the hemline and also the neckline or the upper edge of your collar, it's really important to pin the lining 4 millimeters further inside. This way we will gain some extra length for the lining and make sure that we don't have any unpleasant pleats later. Here you can see it once again, the lining is 4 millimeters further inside, 4 millimeters away from the edge of your outer jacket along the whole hemline, and also at the top, at the neckline, or at the upper edge of your collar. At the front it's laying flush, but then slowly I will pin the lining 4 millimeters further inside. Pin the sleeves together in the same way. Pin the lining of the sleeve at the hem 4 millimeters further inside and pin both sleeve hems together all the way around. Next, stitch both jackets together with a long straight stitch, approximately half a centimeter away from the edge. This is just to make sure nothing shifts and to make it easier later when we are attaching the bias tape. Stitch all edges together and also the sleeve hems. Take your jacket and the bias tape, start at one of both side seams and pin the bias tape to the right fabric side of your outer jacket so that it's protruding the side seam by approximately 1 centimeter, and then fold the beginning over to the bias tape and pin it in place. The resulting edge is now laying flush with your side seam, and then pin the bias tape all the way around to the whole edge. At the bottom and top of the front there are curves, as you can see here, and here it is really important to pin the bias tape very loosely, slightly compressed, to make sure here is no tension at all, because we don't want this area to bulge later. And as you can see here, I even gathered the bias tape a little bit with my fingers. This is how I will proceed with the top curve at the collar or at the round neck too. And at the back neckline, whether you're sewing with or without collar doesn't matter, there is also a curve which is curved inwards, and here the opposite is the case. I will try to pin on the bias tape slightly with a bit of tension to make sure the bias tape lays nice and smooth in the curve. So to summarize it, at the front, top and bottom at the curves here, make sure to pin it very, very loosely, and at the back neckline you can pin it with a tiny bit of tension. And once you reach your starting point, the bias tape will overlap the side seam by 1 centimeter once again, and this thus overlapping the beginning of the bias tape too, and now you can just cut it off. Next, it's time to stitch. I'm sewing with a regular straight stitch right on the first fold, 1 centimeter from the edge, and at all of the curves you can set your stitch to a shorter straight stitch to make sure you can sew here precise, and also make sure not to cause any wrinkles. If you tend to struggle to wrap your bias tape around the edge in the next step, you could also try to sew it on with less seam allowance, like with 0.8 or 0.9 centimeters. In most of the cases, it helps to wrap the bias tape easier around the edge. This is what it will look like, and now clip into the bias tape at all curved parts, right up to until 1 or 2 millimeters before the seam to reduce any tension here. Next, fold your bias tape around the edge. Make sure that it covers the seam on the inside. I would recommend to pin from the outside right at the height at which you will be stitching later. So you can always check on the inside whether you have caught the bias tape or not. If you're struggling to wrap it around your edge, you can try to pull at the bias tape. Due to its being cut on the bias, it's stretchy in both directions and it could help a little bit. And at the side seam, just wrap both ends of the bias tape around the edge one after another for a nice and clean finish. Also make sure to use a lot of pins and pull them out as late as possible later when we are stitching to make sure nothing can shift. If you feel like you cannot wrap your bias tape around your edge because it's too wide, because the edge is too wide, you can always cut back the edge a few millimeters. This usually helps, especially if you're sewing with a very heavy or thick fabric. I don't know if you can see it in this video, but I find it quite helpful to use the grip of my fingers to get the bias tape very close and tight around the edge. Basically, when I'm holding the bias tape, I'm moving my index finger towards the inside and my thumb away from the edge at the same time, and this way you can shift and basically press it very close to the edge. This is what it should look like now. You can double check if you caught the tape on the inside with your pins. Then it's time to stitch. I'm stitching right on the tape 1 to 2 millimeters away from the edge using a regular straight stitch with a stitch length of 3 to 4. And as you can see, I'm pulling the pins out as late as possible to make sure nothing shifts. And if you have, you can also use an upper transportation presser foot here, but it's not necessarily needed. This is what it will look like now, and to erase any wrinkles you can now give it a good press with steam. Last but not least, we need to finish the sleeve hem. It's basically being finished with bias tape the same way. Basically start at the sleeve seam and fold the beginning 1 centimeter over so that the resulting edge is laying flush with your sleeve seam, then pin it to the sleeve hem all the way around so that the beginning and end are overlapping by 1 centimeter. Stitch it on and then wrap it around the edge and top stitch. Last but not least, it's time to install the snap fasteners. First, I'm pinning both fabric layers together right between the markings. You can check if the markings are all 2 centimeters away from the edge. If the distance is correct, you can measure it on the pattern itself. And if the markings are in line, if not, you can still correct any position and then punch holes into both fabric layers. I'm using these Prüm Vario pliers to punch my holes, and I also use this tool to install my snap fasteners, but you can of course use any other tool of your choice. First, I'm grabbing the button cap with the corresponding socket. I will attach those on the right side of the jacket, but basically you can attach them on either side. And at the opposite side, I'm attaching the stud with the corresponding post. And once you've installed the snap fasteners, your jacket is done. I hope you enjoyed this video tutorial and congratulations on your new jacket.